Hello there, I'm Allie and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the first part in a series documenting the making of an 1860s inspired version of Ariel's pink ball gown from Disney's The Little Mermaid. We're going to work on this project from the skin out, so today I'm going to show you how I made my mostly historically accurate chemise and bloomers. I chose the 1860s for this project because not only is it my favorite era of Victorian fashion, but I feel that the 1860s does an excellent job of representing the silhouette, styles, and overall vibe of the gown that we're recreating. Links to materials and patterns will be in the description down below. Let's get into it. Starting with the chemise, I used white cotton lawn and pattern 0707 from Past Patterns on Etsy. In the 1860s, and basically all of history until quite recently, one would almost never wear their clothing directly on their skin. The chemise, sometimes called a shift in earlier history, was worn as the first layer against the body to protect your expensive clothes from the sweat and oils of your skin. This would have been the garment someone would own the most of and would be changed and washed often. Historically, these garments would have been made from linen, but I had a hard time finding linen in the correct weight that wasn't going to cost a kidney a yard, so the next best thing was cotton. Cotton and linen are both natural fibers which wick moisture away from the body, keeping you cool and withstand frequent washing, so they're ideal for garments that are worn against the skin. I cut almost everything out with my rotary cutter, which was definitely dull or had a nick in the blade or something, because it kept leaving skip spots that I had to go back and snip with scissors. I used a water-soluble marker to transfer pattern markings and registration marks. The front and back body of the chemise both start as big rectangles, but the front gets cut into a curved shape at the top to allow space for the bust, which I cut out with scissors. For the pieces that got embroidered, the yoke and the sleeves, I traced the edges of the pattern pieces onto my fabric with my water-soluble marker, and then used an embroidery hoop as a guide for how much extra fabric I needed to leave around the edges to allow the pieces to fit in the hoop and have proper tension. I hate pinning and unpinning things while I'm cutting out pattern pieces, so I use pattern weights, which in this case are just large washers that I got from the hardware store. The yoke facing was cut without any excess. I marked the seam allowance and ½ inch from the pattern edge for hem allowance, yes, I used a pencil, it's fine, and sketched out my embroidery designs with a water-soluble marker. I looked at several extant chemises from the time to gain inspiration for the embroidery. I knew I wanted a scalloped edge, so after trying to freehand that and hating it, I used my Cricut to make a stencil from a clear plastic stencil sheet. I also used my Cricut software to design and print out a shell and seaweed design for the sleeves. These little circles and dots that I'm drawing were meant to look like bubbles, but they did not turn out nearly as bubbly as I pictured in my head. This fabric was sheer enough that I was able to lay my shell and seaweed design under the fabric and see it through quite well. I used stitch and tear as my embroidery stabilizer, cutting a piece a little bit larger than my pattern piece and basting it to the fabric around the edges with a contrasting thread to make it easier for me to take the stitches out later. I used 5 different stitches for the embroidery, a buttonhole stitch for the scallop, a star stitch and a seed stitch for the little dots that were meant to be bubbles at the edge, a stem stitch for the seaweed, and a modified satin stitch for the shell. I used about 2 skeins of embroidery floss that matched the silk I used for my corset, which I'll show you in the next installment in the series, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Each sleeve took about 8 hours to complete, and I actually ended up making 3 of them because I initially chose an iron-on stabilizer, which was great until I realized that I couldn't get it off. It left this awful papery residue on the back of the fabric that I could not remove, no matter what Google and Reddit told me to try. I was thankful for my habit of way overestimating how much fabric I need for a project because I ended up with exactly enough fabric left over to cut all 3 embroidered pieces from the chemise out again. Because of course I had already applied the iron-on stabilizer to the first ones. Before I satin stitched the shell, I did a little bit of pad stitching to give the center of the shell a little bit more of a raised 3D appearance. I mentioned that I used a modified satin stitch. I know that there's an actual name for this stitch, but I can't find it anywhere. It's basically a satin stitch, but as you can kind of see what I'm doing, instead of always bringing the needle up on the left side and down on the right or vice versa, the needle goes up the right side, over, down the left, and then back up the left. It saves thread on the back. You'll kind of see when I show you the back of the piece, but it doesn't have those long lines across the back, so it saves a lot of thread. Once I finished all the embroidery, I removed the stabilizer, which required a pair of tweezers for all the little pieces between and under my stitches. In hindsight, I definitely recognize that I probably could have just soaked the sleeve in water and the stabilizer under the stitches would have just dissolved, but you know, sometimes you like to do things the hard way. Finally, I cut the sleeves out on the pattern lines I marked earlier and did a 1/4 inch rolled hem to finish the free edge, apparently not of which I filmed. Ah, look at my mess of embroidery on the back. To finish the neck edge of the yoke, I pressed the hem allowance for both the embroidered outside and the facing layer in by 1/2 inch. I next pressed the center front opening edges of the yoke in by 1 inch on the right and 1/2 inch on the left. Then, in a blurry and out of frame manner, I whip stitched all the folded edges together, with wrong sides facing each other. The last step for the yoke for now was to prepare the facing for attachment to the body of the chemise by pressing the long edge of the yoke facing in by 1/2 inch. Finally, I'm able to move on to something other than the same 3 pieces I stared at for hours. I cut the opening slit in the front of the chemise down to the marking, and from there, I very carefully pressed both raw edges under, the left side by 1/8 inch twice, and the right by 1/8 inch, and then 1/2 inch to create an overlap or a placket. I used a running stitch to secure the hemmed edges down, and then I pleated and pressed the placket into place. Then I backstitched a little square at the bottom of the placket to keep everything secure. Next, I machine basted 2 lines of stitching between the dots on all of the pieces that required it, one 1/4 inch from the edge and the second 3/8 of an inch from the edge. Then it was time to attach the sleeves. It was starting to get chemise shaped. With right sides together, I matched the X markings on the 4 pieces and pinned, then stitched them together. It took me way more time than I care to admit to figure out this seemingly simple step because I somehow kept getting the sleeves twisted. The gathering threads were also perpetually in my way. Once they were finally pinned correctly and stitched on, I clipped the seam at the X near the underarm and pressed the seam above the notch toward the body of the chemise and the seam under the notch away. This keeps the underarm and side seams smooth. I folded the whole garment in half with right sides together at the shoulder of the sleeve, matching the notches and stitched along the underarm and side seam. To finish the raw edges of the side seams, I overcast the edges together by machine. The sleeve facings also unnecessarily confused me for way too long, but once I finally figured out how to press the edges that would get hand sewn down, it was smooth sailing. I machine sewed the facings to the seam allowance that attaches the sleeves to the body of the chemise, then forgot to film any of the pressing or hand sewing that followed. The process of gathering the chemise body down to fit in the yoke was super fiddly and tedious, and I didn't film any of it, but here it is all pinned and ready to be sewn. This project was my first ever attempt to do hand-sewn buttonholes, and they're awful. I hate them so much that I'm not including any footage of them because they're so sloppy, and they are not sturdy enough to be repeatedly buttoned and unbuttoned, so I just don't ever unbutton the chemise. The final step for the chemise was to hem it. I folded the bottom edge up by 1/4 inch, then by 1 inch, pressed it, and whip stitched it all in place. The bloomers are made from the same cotton lawn as the chemise, using pattern 0706 from Past Patterns on Etsy. My exception for pinning patterns to my fabric is only reserved for when the piece is larger than my cutting table. I stabbed myself twice while doing this, but I genuinely think it's necessary to put actual blood, sweat, and tears into every project, so I was just doing my due diligence. I also cut this out with my scissors, again because it's larger than my cutting table. I already have carpal tunnel in my right hand at 26 years old, so I use my rotary cutter any chance I get. Grandma, look away. I'm about to be really unsafe with my rotary cutter. In all seriousness, please be careful when you are using sharp tools like rotary cutters because I did cut my fingertip off with one once. The bottom of the legs of the bloomers got the same embroidery treatment as the chemise yoke with just the scalloped edge and the little dot bubble deal. I also hemmed it the same ways as I did the sleeves by turning the raw edge up by 1/4 inch twice and whip stitching it down. I did 2 lines of basting stitches at the top of each leg, then sewed the leg holes closed and overcast the raw edges of the seam allowance together by machine. Next was the leg hole facings, and let me tell you that these were so much easier after doing the ones for the chemise. I pressed the raw edges that make up the point in by 1/4 inch, then with right sides together, I stitched the facings to each leg by machine. I trimmed the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch before pressing it toward the inside of each leg. What's this? Clear footage of me hand sewing something? Weird. I whip stitched the facings down, making sure to match the points of the facings at the top of the leg seam. To prep the waistband, I pressed it in half hot dog style first, then pressed one of the long edges in by 1/2 inch. This will make it easier for me to hand sew later. Then, with the right sides together, I stitched the ends closed by machine. I trimmed the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch and pressed the seam flat and beautiful. There really used to be a time when I just wouldn't press anything, and I would like to go back in time and shake myself because why, Allie? Why? To prepare the legs for attachment to the waistband, I pinned the front of the legs together with about 1 inch of overlap, then basted them together by machine. To attach the legs to the waistband, I pinned the ends first, then the center, and then pulled on my gathering threads to gather everything down and slowly kind of pinned across until the gathers were even and everything fit in the waistband. Once everything was meticulously pinned, I sewed it on by machine. I trimmed the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, then flipped the waistband to the inside and pinned that folded bit from earlier to the seam allowance. I top stitched the top of the waistband to prevent bunching and rolling, and then whip stitched the waistband to the inside. Because these buttons needed to be functional and actually open and close all the time, I did them by machine, because I learned my lesson with the hand-sewn buttonholes. I opened the buttonholes with scissors, and then marked where the buttons needed to go on the other side of the waistband. Fun fact, I did not have to buy a single button for any piece of this project because my grandma gave me this amazing lot of buttons, and I just used buttons out of there. I was able to find enough shell buttons in this lot of buttons that matched to do every piece of the project that needed buttons. It was awesome. And with that, the first layer of my 1860s inspired Ariel is done. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, drop a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more from me. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update when I upload for this project or future projects. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!